very simple job in one way. How do we make things easier for banks to access the green bond market is the thesis of what we're looking at. But let me run through a few things to make that work. You know the... Oh, hang on, how do I get back to my slide? Can anyone help figuring out how to get the PowerPoint up? Thank you. Don't know quite how to do it.
So, then, did you share a presentation?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Look, while we're working on it, you kind of know the background. You know why I don't need to talk here about the importance of green buildings. We've had a lot of talk about that this morning. Macro, the climate change situation is not going away. It's getting more severe, despite lots of noise coming in Washington, D.C. The background, I would say, is that in most parts of the world, ambition around the need to achieve climate goals is still a background policy measure. And given that, according to the IEA, 40% of emissions reductions have got to come from the built environment sector, then clearly more is going to have to happen around the built environment. That's not going to change, especially in markets where governments are still concerned about climate goals, and it's quite clear that in Europe, VDL, Teresa Ribeiro and so on are still very fixated on climate goals. Of course, the second part of that, though, is how to simplify the rules that are out there now. In Europe, we've got a very strong push on simplification agenda. Valdis Dombrovskis, Vice President, is working, beavering away at omnibus agenda and various other things. We at Climate Bonds are a great supporter of the simplification agenda. While we have been a key part of developing the Sustainable Finance Action Plan for many years, for about 8 years now, and the EU taxonomy, we've also been pretty vocal in the last few years that some of the requirements of the implementation agenda are far too onerous, difficult, impractical for banks, for homeowners, and so on. The key measure that is coming through, apart from what you've read in the omnibus changes, most of which won't affect banks so much directly, is around do no civic harm compliance. So for those of you that are familiar with the EU taxonomy requirements around green buildings, for existing buildings, you essentially need to show that you're in the top 15% of energy efficiency in any one country, but then you have a whole bunch of do no civic harm requirements that have to be met. All very sensible, but very difficult, if not impossible at times, to find data points for them. We also have some requirements around new buildings, still in flux because we're still concerned about EPBD rules coming through and so on, but the tenor is set. The key change that's coming through is that in the reporting against taxonomy compliance, there will be an option to report against do no civic harm measures as best efforts. That is, you report on what you can. If you can't report, you don't. And that will be seen as acceptable for the purposes of DG FISMA and the European Commission defining taxonomy alignment. That's effectively been the case for investors for some time. Excuse me. Sure. But it's not been the case for the green bonds market. Green property bonds in Europe have been diminished as a result. We've seen a lack of progress in this area. This will free up the market. That's a key background thing that I had to put on the agenda for you. Now, in that context, we are now moving ahead with the relationship between ECBC and climate bonds for a combined joint labelling scheme. Thank you. Perfect. A good bit of last-minute fixing of things. Thank you so much. I won't go through the background that I've covered here now, apart from just to say it's worth understanding what the IEA and others are saying about our priorities, what we need to do. That we need to not only cut emissions by 50% by 2030, that all new buildings need to be net zero by 2030. This is the IEA saying this. 20% of existing buildings need deep energy retrofit. Everything needs to be electrified by 2040. And I'm saying this because this gives you a sense of the policy drift and direction that will be reflected in what it defines as green buildings going forward. And then we need to address embodied carbon and materials, a challenge at the moment in terms of how we get data points about it. One of the things we've done over the last few years is address a challenge in fundraising, the broader green, social and sustainable bond market, which has been quite important for banks in Europe, has now grown from a couple of $1 billion 15 years ago outstanding to we've just gone over $6 trillion US, so 5.5 trillion EUR globally. And Europe is the leader by a country mile, way ahead. You will see headlines of US dollar issuance and so on. What's misunderstood is that a lot of issuance in Europe is actually US dollar as well as euro, so it's a mixture. But overseas issuers in India or Latin America or supranationals are issuing within Europe in US dollar. That's kind of why that's happening. Europe is absolutely the leader in this space. So we've established a proof of concept, which is that if we manufacture a product which will meet the investment requirements of institutional investors, they will move. Subscription rates in this particular market are much higher than vanilla bonds as a rule. You get one extreme where the French Agence France Trésor green bond or Société de Grand Paris were getting 14 to 18 times over subscription rates last year, to banks that might get 2.5 times to 6 times over subscription rates when they can issue a green bond. As I said, the green property bond market has been deflated for the reasons we mentioned. This is an example of how the extent to which it's been deflated. While the total green bond market, very specifically in Europe, has been continuing to rise, apart from a dip as a result of COVID, green property bond markets has been inching up very slowly. How do we unlock this opportunity for banks to take advantage of this particular market? And the advantages at the end of the day are not about sentiment. They are about beneficial pricing in the secondary market, which leads to improved pricing at primary. It's a volatility issue. What we now see over the last 8 years of trading in liquid markets for green bonds is that they have lower volatility. Whenever there's a downturn, they hold their value. And we had this extraordinary moment in 2020, in March of 2020, when for 2 weeks US Treasuries froze globally. Liquidity was a severe problem. Everyone was freaked out about what was going to happen until central banks actually intervened. But I was still getting phone calls from investors in New York saying, you know, I'm still getting bids on green bonds. We had a moment for regular green bond investors where green bonds had superior liquidity characteristics to US Treasuries. What that effectively means is that investors are willing to bid tighter at primary to get the secondary market benefits of green bonds, and that's driving consistent primary market performance. I mean, it's not 100 basis points, it's between 2 and 25 basis points depending on the rating level. But that's pretty significant for a treasury of a bank in raising money. So that's the background to what's going on. Going forward. So again, how do we increase the access? I mean, if we're in the covered bond market, of course, 2 basis points is gold dust. So we're not talking about small beer at scale. So what we're bringing together is a joint labelling program where energy efficient mortgage label combines a client bond standard to reuse each other's material and provide a single label. It'll deliver easier access to the green bond market because investors understand the climate bonds label and some understand the energy efficient mortgage label, banks understand the energy efficient mortgage label, etc. Bring it together. It's essentially fast-track marketing. It's a trusted signal. The climate bonds has been recognised by the Commission, by ESMA, by various others as a trusted party. It automatically meets the requirements, which is the baseline of the reporting and transparency features of the ICMA Green Bond Principles, which is primarily a reporting and transparency measure. Through it, it confirms alignment of Paris Agreement, and it covers all kinds of underlying assets. So the idea is we're combining the two. At the moment, it's going to be available in only 12 countries in Europe because we've got some data availability issues in other countries we're still working on. So they're the countries that apply straight away. Other countries we will be announcing over the course of the year once those data availability issues get sorted. It essentially, as I said, is fast-track to green bond issuance. Any kind of instrument, it can be ABS, not just covered bonds. And it directly links to EU sustainability and transparency goals. What we're trying to create is a perception and understanding amongst investors of high standards of climate integrity for green bond portfolios. Now, to give you an example of one of the things that needs to be done, the energy efficiency mortgage label doesn't necessarily specify the same 15% best-in-class model for each country in its data set. But the data is available to do it. So we now need to just make sure that a bank, if it's issuing a covered bond, addresses the 15% best-in-class measure. There are some details in the process that's help available to do that, to make that work. But we have all the tools we need between the two parties to make this work. It'll also do obvious things like support confidentiality and make the case against greenwashing and how this works. To be able to grow this thematic market, to be able to provide opportunities for regulators to add incentives on it. You know, we already have the beginnings of incentives starting to appear. In Europe, we've got an EU Green Bond Hub program by the European Commission, which is providing technical assistance to parties in different banks, providing investment in emerging markets for green bonds. We've got the European Investment Bank providing support for green bond issuance for municipalities. We've got EBRD, European Bank of Reconstruction and Development, with green bond support programs. If we can link that to a common approach, which is practicable and usable, we're going to be able to get further incentives and support programs being applied to this market for the benefit of banks. We need to make sure that that links to new developments. And so one of the things we'll be working on with ECBC is full alignment of the EPBD regulations coming through as they become clear and so on. Of course, there's still lots of things to be sorted out, like the EPBD new building regulation, which we're still waiting to see exactly what the Commission does. For the purposes of a treasury, this is a product to simplify access to market. There's always a little bit of complication under the hood, as there is in a mortgage portfolio, let alone a green mortgage portfolio. But the point is a simple label, so for investors, we've got a very clear, fair trade kind of label, which is already well known and well understood. We've seen about $270 billion of bonds certified under the climate bond scheme, which are essentially gold standard within the overall market already. We're trying to grow that very quickly as the next step. There is a huge amount of opportunity to get preferential capital into this particular space. Of course, the more we have preferential capital, the more, as the energy efficient mortgage label has been talking about for many years, the more benefits there will be the bank to grow green building portfolios. But of course, there are bigger issues anyway going on. And I want to go back now to the broader policy conversation. While we have the US going crazy, it is working like a vaccination in other countries. We do have the antibodies of stronger and more robust climate action happening in Europe as well as in other countries around the world like China, ASEAN, Brazil, etc., Canada, etc. We expect greater coordination among central banks outside the US now in supporting green instruments and climate instruments. The talk has certainly been along those lines. The network for greening the financial system is not going away. We know that the whole built environment side of things has been under-invested in from a policy perspective in terms of making the changes. We know that DG Energy in Europe is very focused on how to change this going forward. The policy measures to support green buildings will only increase. From a government's perspective, policy measures to support financing of green buildings are fiscally very efficient. So you can expect a lot more space, a lot more happening in this area. What we'd like to see is the market stay ahead of government. The more we can show that this market works, the capital can flow in the right direction to work with banks, the faster governments will step in with further policy measures to enhance, expand and grow that market because of fiscal efficiency. This is what we've seen in other markets already, as regulators around the world have started bringing preferencing for green instruments going forward. And that works very neatly with very straightforward benefits for treasurers in the meantime. Oversubscription rates, the stickiness of investors, and greenium pricing benefits the bulk of the time. I've not yet met a treasurer of a bank who doesn't believe they've got benefits to their green bond program. This is about allowing them to grow those green bond programs quickly and fast. Yes, it has been possible only because of the simplification agenda of the Commission. But the simplification agenda is now well advanced and established, and now we want to make that work for the market. For that, we need conversations with treasuries. Help us out. Contact details on the screen. Thank you, everyone.